Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the committee, especially knowing that it's constituency week. So thank you for taking the time for that. I know how important that is to you. I'm here on behalf of Albertans and Canadians who are struggling with severe financial pressures. They're increasingly desperate because they're facing a cost of living crisis not seen in decades. Over the last 2 years, inflation and high interest rates have driven up prices on everything from food to gas to housing, things that Albertans rely on every single day. Families are being forced to make tough choices just to put food on the table. Businesses are having to make sacrifices to keep the lights on. Social services are under intense strain as more and more people reach out for help, many for the first time in their lives. Albertans and all Canadians need common sense, compassion, and responsible government to prevail. So I'm urging you today to heed the calls of Canadians across the country and suspend the increase in the carbon tax on April 1st. The carbon tax has contributed to and worsened Canadian stress and financial pain. Despite the federal government's claims that Canadians benefit from rebates, the carbon tax on a net basis will cost Albertans more than $900 this year if the tax is implemented. The federal government's own parliamentary budget officer has also said that the cost to each Albertan will more than triple in the next 6 years to a staggering expense of $2,700 net by 2030-2031. This isn't just reckless, it's immoral and it's inhumane. And the added pressure will ruin countless lives, futures, and dreams. It's a weight that Canadians can't bear. And that's why Alberta has been calling on the federal government to eliminate the carbon tax since 2019. Let me repeat what I've said many times before. We understand the importance of achieving carbon neutrality, and we can manage it together as a nation without punishing everyday Albertans. We've demonstrated as much in Alberta, where we are making significant strides towards reducing emissions. And we're doing it without compromising jobs and hurting the industries that have created so much wealth and prosperity for our country, and which will continue to do so if the federal government would just let them. Our province has a long history of climate action, with more than 2 decades of programs and policies that have led emissions reductions and inspired other jurisdictions to follow our lead. Provinces and territories must be able to create emissions reduction plans that reflect their distinct needs and priorities. Alberta's industries are steadily lowering emissions with new technology and investment, even as they compete with foreign suppliers who ignore the need to improve their own performance. And things don't have to be this way. We can effectively reduce emissions without punishing Canadians for trying to stay warm or drive to work or school or a medical appointment. Alberta's already doing it through our carbon trading market. It's the technology, innovation, and emissions reduction regulation just launched actually on NGX this month, and through our emissions reduction and energy development plan, which I released last April. The only thing the federal carbon tax is achieving is higher costs. And in fact, Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault did say it would take until 2060 for it to have an impact. As of April 1st, Albertans will pay around 35 cents in federal taxes for every liter of fuel, along with the carbon tax that also includes the federal excise tax and the GST, which is a tax on tax. The price of natural gas, which Albertans rely on, will also be affected by the carbon tax increase. The carbon tax increase on natural gas is going up to $4.09 a gigajoule, which is more than double the base price of natural gas, which today stands at about $1.72 a gigajoule. The so-called solutions the federal government is to increase the carbon tax on something that is life or death for Albertans in the extreme cold of winter. And I will say that that is, again, inhumane. It begs the question, how far will the federal government go to make life even more difficult and expensive when so many Canadians are already struggling? Alberta municipalities, schools, and healthcare providers are telling us that they need to make cuts and borrow from elsewhere in their budgets just to accommodate the upcoming carbon tax increase. And yet we hear repeatedly that affordability remains a top federal priority. So I'm calling on the federal government to match words with actions. This means working with the provinces to ease Canadians' burdens and strengthen the Canadian economy. Serious challenges like affordability and emissions demand serious responses, and an increased federal carbon tax is nothing of the sort. And Canadians don't want it. You only need to look across the country to see premiers across party lines, 7 of us, and the people they represent stand up against it. If the federal government wants to protect Canadians' quality of life, it should step up and cancel the carbon tax increase immediately. At the very least, the federal government should apply policy equally across the country. We've heard the Quebec representative say several times that Quebec does not pay the fuel tax. And we also would like to see an exemption on all forms of home heating, not just ones that are centered in Atlantic Canada and on a particular type of fuel. It must do this for the sake of fairness for all Canadians. The people of this country deserve nothing less. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Premier Smith. We'll start with Mr. Halland. Before we do, though, just to keep on time and respect the Premier's time, we're going to stay exact for timing. I will cut off on them right on the 6 and 5 minute mark, so please watch your time. Mr. Halland, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'll just start off by saying how I feel it's very shameful for the finance chair, Peter Fonseca, that went into hiding as soon as the premiers came calling to call a meeting on their request. Premier, thank you for being here and thank you for joining 70% of Canadians and 6 other premiers, including a Liberal premier, in telling this Liberal NDP government to spike the hike on the road to axing the tax by a common sense Conservative government. The PBO once again reconfirmed that families are at a net loss on average because of this carbon tax scam. For example, in Alberta, a family will pay $2,900 into this carbon tax scam. And according to the finance minister herself, she said that families, and she was bragging that Alberta families get $1,800 in rebates and that somehow Albertans should be grateful for this. Premier, can you please tell Canadians the human toll that this carbon tax scam puts on Albertan families so that the Liberals can understand the real pain it causes?
Well, I can tell you a couple of things. The way I think most Albertans look at it is the government is taking $1 and promising to give back 75 cents. And everybody knows that that's not a good deal. We've seen in the polling that people don't support the increase. They don't support the tax. And I can tell you an MNP report from October 2023 showed that 51% of Canadians are $200 or less away from being unable to meet their financial obligations. We also find that in Alberta, people are more likely to say that their level of debt is concerning to them, 51%, and that they are worried about their ability to repay their debts, 71%. So we took a number of affordability measures in order to be able to offset these costs over the last number of years. Foregone revenue of $7 billion. In fact, I'd be happy to itemize it if the member would like to ask me about it. But we are now at a point where we have to run a balanced budget as well. And we're just asking for the federal government to recognize that it's their turn to do their part to ease the affordability crisis.
Thank you, Premier. As you mentioned, in Atlantic Canada, when their Liberal MPs were revolting because their poll numbers were tanking, Atlantic Canada got a carve-out. Alberta got no such carve-out, just like the rest of Canada. Do you feel this is just another blatant attack on Alberta?
Look, I know that the question has been raised about the Supreme Court decision on the carbon tax, and I believe that the Supreme Court decided in favor of the government on that because they were making the argument that it was such an important national issue, it needed to be dealt with in a national way, and the rules needed to apply equally across the country. And yet we've heard the Quebec members say that they don't pay a carbon tax. We have heard as well that in Atlantic Canada, the most polluting home heating fuel, in fact, which is home heating oil, now has a reprieve for 3 years. Meanwhile, many of the provinces in the West made the decision years ago to switch to cleaner burning natural gas, and we're getting punished for it. So I would just appeal to this committee that if you want to apply the carbon tax, it has to be applied equally across the country in all provinces for all types of fuel. And if you're not going to apply it that way, then you need to give a reprieve across the country so that everybody is treated fairly. I think it's creating a national unity crisis, and I do believe that it's the obligation of the members around this table representing all parties to ensure fairness in the way each citizen is treated in the country if they have the mandate to do so.
Chair, I'm just going to raise a point of order. And
Sure. Go
my,
ahead, Mr.
my sincere apologies to the Premier. I don't want to be disrespectful. I think yesterday, I see Mr. Halland has a prop on his computer. Yesterday, you deemed that to be a prop, so I would just suggest that if he can not display that while he's on the screen, I'll appreciate it because.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can't see from the angle I'm at, but oh yes, Mr. Nackby has a point. If you wouldn't mind, thank you, sir.
Too bad the Liberals are triggered by a sticker once again. Premier, when you talk about national unity crisis, I think of Stephen Guilbeault, who, as far as I know, is the only minister that has been in handcuffs and in an orange jumpsuit. Can you please speak a little bit about how dangerous his ideology is when it comes to our clean, responsible, low carbon energy sector for Alberta and Canada's prosperity?
I should just make sure the committee knows exactly why Stephen Guilbeault faced law problems. One was for the stunt he pulled on the CN Tower. The other was that he climbed on the roof of our Premier, Ralph Klein, when his wife Colleen was home, terrifying her. So you can imagine how Albertans feel that this is the person now responsible for enacting emissions policy. I would say that we've been able to work constructively with the federal government on a number of areas. They have worked with us on establishing a net zero petrochemical plant with Dow Chemical, a net zero hydrogen plant with Air Products. We're in the process of getting to the final finish line on a net zero cement plant with Heidelberg. They've worked with us on de Havilland to make sure that we've got water bombers being built, not only in our province, but will also help the rest of the country. So I don't want to say that it's uniformly negative, but the spirit of cooperative federalism means that you do not take unilateral action in an area of provincial jurisdiction. It means that you work collaboratively. And I think the court has chastised the federal government, led by, in this area, Stephen Guilbeault, on 2 occasions for that, the Impact Assessment Act, as well as the plastics ban. The approach that I would like to see them take is to work collaboratively with us the way we have, not come through with a cap on a particular industry, oil and gas emissions, which they have announced, or a cap on methane, which they have announced, which will disproportionately impact our province. Their proposal for a net zero power grid outside the Constitution under Section 92 and clearly demonstrates they don't understand how our electricity market works. Net zero vehicles, having 20% vehicles being sold by 2026. We know that that will simply kill our auto sector.
Premier,
and reduce our ability.
I apologize. I have to ask you to wrap up.
Of course, those are just some examples, and not to mention that the minister doesn't seem to want to build roads. It's like he hasn't ever left downtown Montreal. It's a big country.
Thank you very much, Premier. Thank you, Mr. Helland. Mr. Sousa, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and Premier, appreciate you being here, and I apologize for those earlier points of order. As you can appreciate, a Conservative chair brought you here without consultation of this committee to talk about main estimates, but now we're talking about something else completely different, which is meant for the Finance Committee. And yesterday we put forward a motion, the last motion, which the Conservative chair did not allow us to pass. He adjourned, which made it very clear what the will of the committee was, notwithstanding the misinterpretation of an earlier motion. So I just wanted to preface that by saying to you that we appreciate you being here, but we also recognize the politics involved and the partisanship that's taking place. And can you advise us, when were you contacted to appear before this committee?
Sure, I was contacted. We wrote a letter on March the 26th asking to appear before the Finance Committee.
No, the OGO committee. When were you approached to approach
correct.
OGO?
After we'd written our letter, we were approached on the same day, March the 26th, to appear before the committee.
Thank you for that. Another item is the notion of reducing emissions in Canada and reducing emissions across all provinces, trying to make Canada competitive. You reaffirm very eloquently the initiatives that are being taken, not just in the province of Alberta, but everywhere, in respect to trying to be innovative, the green economy, to do things concurrently. We are still a big oil and gas country. We still net a lot of revenue and recognize the importance of that export. We also recognize the importance of making it cleaner where possible to get it through. And those are important initiatives. I worked out in Calgary for many years in the early 80s, as did many of those from out east who work out west. And I appreciate the industry. However, for our kids' sake, for your sake, for all of our sake, we want to make Canada even better, notwithstanding. And in Ontario, where I had the privilege of representing for some months, years, I should say, as Minister of Finance, we also brought in the cap and trade system. Similar to Quebec, we're part of the Western Climate Initiative to be exempt from the federal alternative, to be competitive and reinvest dollar for dollar into innovative industries while again being competitive. We have cement plants, we have a lot of things, as do you in Alberta, and you do trade. You've talked about some of the credits that you take advantage of, and Ontario was netting 1.5 billion or so in net earnings to be reinvested. And then a Conservative government came in and did away with that to pick a fight with Justin Trudeau, the Premier or the Prime Minister, on carbon tax when it was unnecessary. And here we have an opportunity to do things. I need to understand the incentive now that Alberta has been taking to innovate and bring forward all of these great reductions to emissions. Why are you doing that?
Well, I should say that we showed leadership back in 2007 by setting the first price on carbon, I believe, in North America. And we've continued with our industrial carbon pricing ever since. It's been renamed to the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction program. And the way it works is that industry is expected to be able to meet a certain standard. If they are above that standard, they pay into the fund. And then we use the fund to be able to reduce emissions elsewhere. So since 2009, we have seen over $2 billion invested through emissions reduction Alberta.
Yeah, those are fantastic. Why not expand it further? Like, why did you not take it a step further? Because we all recognize the importance of pricing carbon. Do you believe pollution should be free?
We have taken it further. We have asked for a recognition from ECCC to be able to acknowledge our tier program as being equivalent, and they did until 2030. And so we part of the way we did that is that we matched our increases with the federal increases. So by 2030, it'll go up to $170 on industrial emissions. We're talking today about retail emissions, and I look at those as being two totally different things.
And I understand. Yeah, I appreciate
sorry,
that.
Sorry.
It's my time.
I also just want to say we also expanded it to include more. We included
I got about a minute
anyone
left.
under
I got about a
2,000. My
minute left.
apologies.
No, I appreciate what you're saying. And we do offer rebates as a result of the consumer spending so that they get more than they receive. About 8 out of 10 families get that benefit. On another note, in Ontario, we also were looking at providing a Ontario pension plan to supplement the Canada pension plan, to add to it. And the whole intent was to enhance CPP to make it even stronger. It's also a matter of unity. It's a matter of protecting all Canadians. You spoke at the start of talking about Albertans and Canadians for the nation's benefit. Can you explain what benefit there is to Albertans by withdrawing from CPP, creating more costs, and putting at risk their retirement?
Well, there is a formula in the Act that was insisted upon by Ontario, so that if Ontario ever wanted to get out of the Canada pension plan, there would be clear rules for how to do that. We applied that methodology and found that every year Albertans pay more in premiums than they get back in benefits. With that invested over time, it has grown to about $334 billion that we would be entitled to based on the formula in the Act. I think it's important for all Albertans to know, and also all Canadians to know, just how unbalanced Confederation is, just how much Alberta does pay into Confederation.
When Ontario was a so-called have-not province, it still provided $11 billion more to the rest of the Federation than it received, whereas other provinces, and that has happened with Alberta, but it's a national unity issue. It's about protecting Canadians. It's also about protecting Albertans for their future retirement. Before I let you go, can you document the times that you were called upon to come to this committee so that we can have that report back as well?
Certainly, it was just the one time, and we said yes immediately.
Thanks. That is our time. Mr. Savard Tremblay, please, for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and Premier. Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you for your presentation. When it comes to overall federal spending, well, oftentimes there's encroachment, tramping on provincial areas of jurisdiction.
Translation setting on my end. My apologies.
Sorry, Mr. Savard Tremblay. We'll pause the time and check for interpretation.
Testing one. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel.
There's a little like globe icon.
There might be a little globe button at the bottom for interpretation, bottom of your screen for Zoom.
Original audio English. Listen in English.
Perfect.
Let me just see if that works. Sorry, I'm new to the simultaneous translation. I hope that works.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Take your time and start again, Mr. Tremblay, or Savard Tremblay, please.
Oui. Alors, vous me permettez de recommencer.
If I may start from scratch, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Well, good morning, Premier, and thank you for your presentation. When it comes to federal spending, there's often encroachment and trampling on provincial areas of jurisdiction. You enacted an Alberta Sovereignty Act, and as a member of the Bloc Québécois, I'm quite sympathetic to that notion. I'm fighting for the complete independence of my nation, and I want to know what motivated you. What was the root cause of this? Is it because the Constitution was being flouted? Was the spending encroaching on your areas of jurisdiction? What kind of interference prompted you to do this?
Mostly it's been the various legal actions we've had to take against the federal government. We've had a victory on the Impact Assessment Act, which you know is Bill C-69. We had a success initially on the declaration of plastics being toxic, also deemed to be unconstitutional. But I can tell you my Justice Department is very busy. We have about 14 different actions that we are going to be taking against the federal government for various ways in which they're interfering with our jurisdiction. If you read the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, so I don't share your aspiration on separation, we just believe that the Constitution should be abided, that the Constitution was written in a way that gives sovereign powers to the provincial levels of government and sovereign powers to the federal levels of government, and talks about the need for cooperative federalism, that the federal government cannot interfere in an area of provincial jurisdiction unilaterally. And I think that's being borne out with some of the court decisions they've now lost.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Sorry about the lag. It's so that I can hear the interpretation. Well, listen, I know that we don't necessarily share the same aspirations. We didn't sign the Constitution in Quebec. At the very least, we'd like it to be upheld. That would be at least something. But the fact is that we would like the Constitution to be upheld and that there be no encroachments that fly in the face of the Constitution. Now, as far as federal spending is concerned, there are oftentimes programs that involve encroachment, and in the last budget there are new taxes that are again a trampling on provincial jurisdiction. Sometimes programs are introduced which on the surface ostensibly aren't encroachment on provincial areas of jurisdiction, but open the door to such meddling. Do you have misgivings about that kind of approach?
We certainly do. And in one way, we've been inspired by Quebec, by your premier, in some of the policies that he has established to establish guardrails around provincial jurisdiction. In particular, one of the things we like to emulate is that if there is an area of federal encroachment using the spending power, we've observed that Quebec has particular success at being able to opt out and be able to receive the full compensation. And that is a strategy that we have started to employ and will continue to do that.
Donc, vous souhaitez, si je puis me permettre.
So, if I could paraphrase you, you would like more power for Alberta, more areas of jurisdiction, and if so, which, please?
We would certainly like for our full area of constitutional jurisdiction to be respected. I mean, I recognize that the federal government's responsible for military, for international trade agreements, for international agreements, even like those signed at the COP meetings, for our for passports, for immigration, for currency. There are some areas that are concurrent that we would like to be able to collaborate on, like immigration, but I don't have any interest on encroaching on any of those areas. In fact, if I tried to set up my own currency or establish my own passport office, then people would say, that's crazy, that's federal jurisdiction. I think people should say exactly the same thing when the federal government encroaches on our jurisdiction. They should say, you can't do that. The Constitution doesn't allow it. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that it works both ways, and we're trying to assert that it should.
Ceci dit, Madame Smith, je pourrais vous dire.
Well, were passports to be within your purview, well, obviously the results wouldn't be worse than we've seen in Ottawa in recent times. But that said, it's my understanding that Quebec's model is one that you may wish to emulate. I know that previously there were individuals such as Stephen Harper, who wrote a letter stating that Quebec was his role model, and that in Alberta you'd like the same kind of framework. So it's an inspiration for you, Quebec?
It is. Let me just give a recent example. I noticed that your premier asked to be able to choose 100% of newcomers coming to his province through the provincial nominee program. I would like that same aspiration. We have been home to 57,000 evacuees from Ukraine. Many of them are using our provincial nominee program. And instead of increasing the amount of provincial nominees that we've asked for to 20,000, the federal government reduced them. So I think that's a violation, quite frankly, of Section 95 of the Constitution, which gives us concurrent jurisdiction. And we'll be pressing that. And perhaps Quebec would like to work with us on that.
Thank you very much. That is our time. Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Premier Smith, for being with us. Maybe I'll pick up where my Bloc colleague just left off. You mentioned that Quebec is an inspiration to Alberta, and Quebec has taken a different approach to this whole issue of carbon pricing, the only province in Canada to be part of a cap and trade or a carbon market with, I believe, California and Washington. Is that something that Alberta has looked to participate in as an alternative to the federal backstop?
I think that we have our own program. If I understand the Quebec program, there's 172 industrial outfits that operate under their cap and trade system. I believe actually ours is more expansive. I'm not sure of the total number, but we did have large emitters that were under the program. We just recently reduced the threshold so that anyone who emits, I believe it's more than 2,000 megatons a year, can also participate in our emissions reduction program. So if they are able to do better than the average in their industry, they will generate credits. Those credits can then be sold so that they can turn it into a revenue stream. So yes, we've modeled our industrial program similarly to Quebec. At the moment, it is just internal to trade within Alberta, but it has been advocated to me that we should be looking at ways of expanding it.
So you would look like, for instance, if you participated in the same carbon market as Quebec, then this whole issue of the carbon tax wouldn't be an issue for Albertans. It's not an issue for Quebecers because they're part of a different system that they've signed up for. Are you currently looking at whether to participate in that same system?
No, we won't participate in that system because, quite frankly, we transfer enough money to Ottawa that then gets spent in equalization to Quebec. So we're not looking for another way of transferring dollars out of Alberta to Quebec. What we are interested in doing is finding ways of generating our own offsets through our investment in Dow Chemical, Petrochemical, which is net zero, Air Products, hydrogen, which is net zero, Heidelberg net zero cement. We also are keen to work with the federal government on establishing an ammonia market so that we would be able to reduce emissions internationally. Article 6 has been mentioned by previous premiers. If we could simply reduce China's reliance on coal by 20%, that would offset all of the emissions of all of Canada. We also have geothermal that we are investing in. We just launched our very first competitive hydrogen fueling station, and we'll be building out our hydrogen infrastructure. We've partnered with the federal government on dual fuel vehicles for long haul. We've partnered with the federal government on hydrogen buses. So those are the kind of ways that we want to generate our own credits that can be used to offset our emissions so that we can get to net zero by 2050. At some point, once that market is more developed, perhaps we would look at having those emissions credits traded more broadly. But at the moment, we're keeping it as an internal market.
So you mentioned Article 6 and this idea that we can get some sort of credits for our exports, even when those products are consumed in other jurisdictions. And Canada does export some clean products. However, we also export some products that aren't so clean, including thermal coal. Should the impact of burning thermal coal in other jurisdictions also count against our domestic emissions?
Well, I can tell you, we don't export thermal coal, as I understand. I think that's mostly British Columbia that does that.
I'm not saying Alberta, but I'm saying Canada, because of course Article 6 would apply on a national basis, I believe. Correct?
Well, you actually have the ability under Section 6.2 as a subnational government to also go and negotiate those kinds of partnerships. I can tell you how South Korea and Japan and India are looking at it. Since they do have a large coal fleet, they're looking at dual combustion. So if we can apply either hydrogen or ammonia so it can be combusted at the same time, that reduces the overall emissions profile. And if there's a way for us to export those products and then get joint credit, whether it's 50-50 or whether they take 80% and we take 20%, we think that that's good for the planet. We think that that would be the way that we would make the largest reduction in emissions globally.
But I guess my question still stands. Should we not also be, should our exports of dirty products also be accounted for in the same way that our export of clean products are?
Look, it's a global market and it's a global problem, and we have to reduce global emissions. And the way I look at it is that if we can live up to the spirit of what we signed on to in COP28, which recognizes natural gas as a transition fuel, a vitally important transition fuel, then we'll be able to reduce the overall global emissions profile. I can tell you what countries like South Korea and Japan and others tell us is that if they can't get those long-term supplies of things like LNG or ammonia, then they're just going to have more unabated coal that they bring on stream, which will actually increase overall emissions. So I would say that if we, in the spirit of looking at this as a global problem, understanding that there are interim measures that need to be taken, it seems to me that those are the kind of things that we should be partnering with our friends and allies on.
So you mentioned COP28 and the Paris Agreement. Do you support Canada remaining in the Paris Agreement?
Yes.
And the Paris Agreement predominantly is focused on reducing domestic emissions. You mentioned Article 6, but at this point, Article 6 hasn't been used to provide credits for the export of energy products from our country. The largest part of the Paris Agreement is reducing domestic emissions. And in that challenge, we have a plan put forward by the government that you take issue with. Have you tabled an alternative proposal, as the Prime Minister has suggested, that would contribute to meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement?
Yes. We,
very brief answer. I apologize, Premier.
Sure. My very first conversation with the Prime Minister was to tell him we were aligning with a 2050 target like our allies, and that I would produce an emissions reduction and energy development plan, which I did last April. And we've been working on a number of tables for how we will work on achieving some of those interim steps.
Thank you, Premier.
Thank you very much. Ms. Goodridge, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Premier for taking your time here today to stand up for Albertans. We've seen now the country like Germany, Japan, and most recently Greece come asking the Prime Minister about LNG, and unfortunately his answer every single time seems to be there's no business case. I don't think he's correct. Can you give a bit of a snapshot as to what LNG would mean for our province?
I can tell you what it would mean for our country, what it would mean for our partner, British Columbia, as well, what it would mean for First Nations who are increasingly developing LNG export facilities. We've been very supportive of our Indigenous communities being able to develop resources, take an equity stake, and be able to generate income. So, for instance, we have a $3 billion Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. I see that British Columbia has also established a $1 billion loan guarantee to allow nations to buy equity stakes in a variety of different projects. So, for instance, there's a 900 megawatt Cascades power plant that is Indigenous owned. We've got pipeline networks that are Indigenous owned. And so I'm very much looking forward to seeing the impact that will have. It's going to deliver $1.2 billion worth of revenue to our nations in Alberta. And I would encourage every province to do the same, as well as the national government to do the same. The value of natural gas right now is very low. It's $1.72 per gigajoule, as I was mentioning, but it becomes the base fuel for so many products that can be used in the transition. LNG and ammonia are the most stable ways to transport the hydrogen molecule. And so being able to do both of those, I think, opens up new markets as well as reduces emissions. We developed our Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, where we give a 12% rebate for anyone who uses natural gas as a feedstock fuel. It's part of the reason why Dow Chemical and Air Products have located in our industrial heartland. I should also mention that when we have done a survey of our pore space, we have the best pore space in the world for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, second only to Russia. And that is part of the reason, because we have an at-scale project that was done by Shell Quest, and we have an at-scale project for the carbon trunk line. We're immediately able to capture those CO2 emissions. The pore space we have, I'm told by my officials, is so large it could theoretically capture all of the emissions already produced by man so far. So we are very keen to make sure that natural gas, in the spirit of COP28, remains that transition fuel. So not only we can help ourselves, our Indigenous partners, the Canadian economy, but also our international partners.
Thank you for that, Premier. So speaking of natural gas, we did see this winter a carve out for Atlantic Canadians on their home heating, but not for natural gas, which is how most of us here in Alberta heat their homes. Do you think that's fair?
Not fair at all. In fact, when you look at how it's December, January, February, and March that we have the greatest need for natural gas. I noticed there's members on the committee from Ontario. Ontario also relies on natural gas principally for home heating. And most people would have been able to enjoy a break during this winter because natural gas is trading so low. But when you layer on a carbon tax that is twice the amount that people are paying for their base fuel and it's itemized on our home heating bills, we see it, we feel it, especially since we know that home heating oil is about 1.25 times more intensive on CO2 emissions. To see that anyone who is using home heating oil with a higher emissions profile is able to get a 3-year break while we're suffering through the minus 35-degree winters that we often have, it's absolutely not fair. And I do think it is the obligation of the members of Parliament to ensure that fairness in application of federal policy applies to all products in all regions for all types of uses, and that's not happening.
Yeah, I know it's truly unfortunate how asymmetrical the approach from the federal government has been on so many of these issues. The solution that the Prime Minister and his eco-activist minister brought forward were heat pumps, and as you know, I'm in Fort McMurray. Heat pumps don't work super well in minus 50. In fact, they don't really work in minus 20. Do you think heat pumps are a good solution for northern Alberta winters?
They may work in some jurisdictions, but I can tell you in Alberta, my understanding is our insurance companies will not insure a home that only has a heat pump. It needs to have a secondary backup because, as you described, in most places of the province, it will routinely get below minus 30. If pipes freeze, that causes a major insurance wreck. And so they're just not practical in the extremely cold climate that we have in Alberta.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your strong advocacy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kusmirchuk, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Premier, for being here with us today and having this important conversation. Affordability is absolutely at the center of everything that our federal government is doing, and I appreciate that you are part of that work. I wanted to set the record straight right off the bat. The oil to heat pump affordability program is not just available to communities in the Atlantic provinces. That is a program that is available across Canada from coast to coast to coast across all communities. And as you rightfully pointed out, Premier, home heating oil is often the most expensive, but also the most polluting type of oil. And so again, our federal government has extended that program to all communities across Canada, including in Alberta and including in my home province of Ontario. Premier, I also wanted to highlight the fact that, again, I appreciate how the chair has unilaterally called these meetings and invited yourself and others to testify here because it is such an important meeting. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that it is interesting to me that out of the permanent Conservative members of this OGO committee, none have showed up other than the chair to ask questions of the Premier of Alberta, Premier of Saskatchewan, even though 3 of those permanent members are from Alberta and Saskatchewan. I wanted to highlight the irony of that as well too, and it is unfortunate. But nonetheless, those that are here are really keen on talking about affordability and about climate change, which are top priorities for this government. Premier, I am very concerned about the fact that you're here to talk about and raise your concerns about the carbon pricing, which will add 3 cents per liter on gas on April 1st. And yet at the same time on April 1st, Premier, you are raising the gas tax in your home province to 13 cents, increasing it by 4 cents. I understand you were at an Axe the Tax rally yesterday, I believe, with the leader of the opposition. Can you clarify for me whether you were protesting? Was it a rally to axe your tax on the gas tax, which is adding 4 cents to a liter? If you can just clarify that for me, if you were at a rally to axe the tax that you are increasing in your province by 4 cents.
Sure, happy to answer that. I should let you know that there are 12,000 Albertans that have home heating oil of our nearly 5 million population. So I think just by those numbers, you can see that your program does not apply equally across the country. I would say as well that as I mentioned, we have had $7 billion worth of foregone revenues because we've been trying to compensate for the inflation crisis at the federal level. In fact, we
Premier,
had
sorry, I don't mean to obtrude. My time is limited here, but are you speaking out against your government's 4 cent increase on the gas tax on April 1st? I'm just curious. And will the government listen to your concerns?
Well, the federal government charges 35 cents in gasoline taxes. We charge 13 cents. Our 13 cents goes to build roads. If your environment minister would let you build roads, maybe some of yours would go to build roads as well.
We do. Thousands of them every year. We do.
Well, he certainly doesn't seem to want to anymore.
Yes.
And the 17 cents, as we know, will not go to build roads.
Premier, I appreciate you not wanting to answer my question on that very sensitive issue of you raising the gas tax by 4 cents in your province, especially in a period right now of really where there's an affordability crisis. But I am very worried about the fact, Premier, that last year you had 2.2 million hectares of land burned in Alberta, and you had 299 days of smoke days in the city of Edmonton, both records, absolute records. Can you tell us whether climate change caused these wildfires and these smoke days? Yes or no?
I would say that 60% of the fires are caused by human activity. And so we're doing a public campaign to make sure that people are safer.
Well, I thought you would say that, Premier, because I looked at a report from your own Forestry and Parks, which stated that there were 1,121 wildfires last year. Of those, 91 were caused by arson, which is and that includes 262 acres. Out of the 2.2 million acres that were burned, it's only 0.1% of land that was burned was caused by human activity. Can you speak about the vast majority that was caused by, again, by drought conditions and the heat conditions in your province? And furthermore, the most important question, Madam Premier, what are you doing to fight climate change and the forest fires and the drought in your community that is devastating land in your community and communities?
Well,
I apologize, but
60%.
Premier Smith, I apologize, but Mr. Kuzmierczuk has used up his time. You can respond in writing because I understand we do have to get you out at a certain time. I apologize. Mr. Savard Tremblay for 2.5, please. Oh, Mrs. Vignola, I apologize. Welcome back. 2.5, please.
Merci beaucoup. Madame.
Thank you very much, Premier. Thank you very much for being here at the committee. Now, my colleague spoke to you about our desire for autonomy, the sovereignty. We don't necessarily have the same take on what that would look like, but when it comes to the current budget, we're talking about over $250 billion that are being transferred to Quebec and the Canadian provinces, including transfers to governments, seniors and family benefits, and that's a substantial amount. But despite how substantial those finance allocations or funding allocations are, the transfer payments for healthcare to the provinces are not adequate. Now, I think you demanded or requested 35%. And what will the federal government's refusal in that regard have in terms of an impact on Alberta's finances?
The way the program was initially drafted, it was supposed to be an equal cost sharing program. I think over time it developed to a 65-35% cost sharing program, and all the premiers advocated for the federal government to live up to that spirit. They didn't, but we have to make sure that we're providing health care regardless of whether the federal government wants to be a partner. So we're in the process of doing a major hiring of family doctors, nurse practitioners, so we can shore up our primary care system. We're working on getting alternative levels of care patients into appropriate facilities for continuing care, addiction treatment, mental health. And we're going to be expanding our surgical capacity. Those are the things we're going to do, regardless of whether the federal government wants to be an equal partner.
Donc, je comprends que le poids sur
So I understand that this burden on Alberta's finances is getting bigger and bigger, and is that correct?
I think it's the case for every province. I believe that when we first started being concerned about healthcare costs, it was consuming 20% of our budget. Now it's over 40%, and we still have the pressure of the baby boom population that is going to add not only surgical costs, but also long-term care costs. Plus, we're in the middle of a mental health and addiction crisis, so the pressures are going to continue.
En effet. Vous parliez...
Mr. Backrack, go ahead, please, for 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Premier, previously you mentioned the government's decision to create a carve-out for Canadians who heat with home heating oil. And you mentioned the inequity of the way that that was approached, and I think there's some agreement there. Our proposal was somewhat different, to give Canadians a break by taking the GST off all forms of home heating. Is that an approach that you would support, given
Yes.
that it would create equity and it would actually result in more savings for people right across the country, regardless of how they heat?
I think it's a great idea, because then it would also remove the problem of the tax on tax that we have on both home heating costs as well as on the price at the pumps. I think it would be a reasonable, just sort of reasonable compromise.
And why do you think that the government, instead of doing that, chose the approach that they did?
Well, I think they want to take credit for transferring back 75 cents on the dollar, thinking that people aren't going to notice that they took the dollar in the first place. And I guess I would look at it and I sort of question the approach. I kind of wonder what the Liberal members think is going to happen with those dollars. So they come back with $400. Do they think someone's going to go out and buy a $60,000 electric vehicle? Do they think they're going to put $10,000 of solar panels on their roof? Do they think that they're going to convert to geothermal, which costs $20,000? Like, if we want to make a real impact on the kind of vehicles people drive and the kind of heating that they use, those are substantially more investments that are going to be made than a token measure to rebate back a tax. I think I would rather see other programs that would stimulate those kinds of choices.
And you mentioned the emissions plan that you have tabled.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I assume that this is a commitment to reduce absolute emissions in Alberta over time towards this goal of 2050. In that plan, have you done an analysis of the cost per ton? Like, as I understand it, you're relying heavily on technologies that are not only expensive, but aren't proven at scale. Has there been an analysis on the cost per ton relative to other approaches, like the pricing approach that the federal government has taken?
Well, I can tell you that we will have 3 net zero major industrial operations within the next 2 years. Air Products Hydrogen, the Dow Chemical, Petrochemical, Heidelberg Cement, and let me add Interpipeline as well, because they're going to be an ammonia project. And we do have at scale ability, because our former Premier Ed Stelmach invested over $1 billion in building out Shell's Quest project so that we could firm out the technology. It has now stored 11.5 billion metric tons of CO2, I believe, over in
the question was very specifically on the cost per ton of those reductions. Is there an analysis that shows that using those approaches to reduce emissions on a cost per ton basis is less expensive for Canadians than the approach that the federal government has taken?
Well, I can tell you, when I hear the federal environment minister say his approach won't work till 2060, and I've just given you 4 examples that will work within 2 years, it does seem to be that the outcome is what we should be looking at. And if we can get to a net zero outcome, that should be the goal.
Thanks. That is our time. We'll have 2 last 4-minute rounds. Mr. Lawrence, go ahead, please.
And thank you, Premier Smith, for being here today. Appreciate your time. My question will focus on the carbon tax and productivity. Of course, Canada is, as Governor of the Bank of Canada said, in a productivity crisis. One shining example, or exception, I might say, is Alberta. The average GDP example per worker is about $50 per hour, I should say, about $50. In the energy sector in Alberta, it's $500. My concern is that the carbon tax and other actions by this federal government are putting sand in the gears of our economy and slowing down our productivity when we can least afford it. Would you share my concern?
I do share the concern, and I can tell you that we have had to take a whole variety of measures in order to be able to assist our individuals so that households are able to manage through the inflation crisis that we're facing and have more dollars in their pocket in order so that they can go out and buy the things that they need to, so that we can keep the economy rolling. We had our fuel tax relief program, which I mentioned saved $2.3 billion because we took it off for 2 entire years. We re-indexed Asian income supports. We gave $20 million to food banks. We've reduced the increase year over year in auto insurance. We've re-indexed our personal income tax. We've supported post-secondary students with a cap on tuition increases. We've supported wage growth in the social sector. We've given rental supplementary supports. We've created an affordable housing plan that'll spend $8 billion over the next 3 years. We've reduced electricity costs through rebates at a cost of $500 per household or $1 billion over the course of that. And we've given affordability payments of $100 per month for 6 months to our lowest income individuals at a cost of $625 million. All of these are to make sure that people have enough money in their pocket to be able to keep our economy going, because that lends itself to businesses being able to have the dollars they need so that they can make the investments they need to make so that they can improve productivity. It would be helpful if the federal government would stop making it so hard for people and did something equivalent to put the same amount of dollars in the pocket of consumers so that we could keep our economy going strong.
Thank you very much, Premier Smith. And to prove that Ontarians can indeed share with Albertans, I'm going to split the rest of my time with Mr. Alon.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Premier, thanks again for being here and always standing up for Albertans. I'm interested to know, what are you hearing from our great Alberta ranchers, our farmers, our agri-food industry and producers about this carbon tax scam?
I can tell you they're very frustrated because they're producing food not only for us, but for the world. We know that we're not only in an energy security crisis, but a food security crisis. And if you talk to the grain growers, they'll tell you they are already a net negative business. So yes, they do have inputs, but they're reducing the amount of fertilizer they use and the inputs that they use. But their whole business model is capturing CO2 into the food products for export. When you talk to ranchers, it's the same approach, that ranchers do an amazing job managing biodiversity and our landscapes. Our landscapes in Alberta were created by millions of bison roaming on the lands. And because of that deep fescue, it captures the CO2, not only in the blades of grass, but then also deep into the root system and also the microbes that are in the soil, increasing organic material. And none of that seems to be understood, is that in fact our food producers are providing a service to the planet, not only providing a secure supply of food, but also in addressing some of these environmental issues. So they're very frustrated that every time they use an input, they get walloped with a tax, but they don't get the credit for the biodiversity offsets they provide.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nakfi, go ahead, please, sir, for 4 minutes.
You, Premier. Premier, you were speaking about affordability issues in Alberta and across the country. On the other hand, you are raising your gas tax by 4.5 cents. Does it come with a rebate for Albertans, very similar to how the price on pollution through the Canada Carbon Rebate will be giving $2,160 to rural Albertan families?
We eliminate it completely when the price goes above $90, which we did for 2 years. We will eliminate it again when it starts, when the price trends above 80. I'd in fact love to see the federal government do the same thing, that when gas prices are high, they take their tax off completely like we do. And when they're low, they bring it back on.
Sorry, Premier, I have a very limited time. So the answer is that there will be no rebate for Alberta families for the increase they will see on April 1st by 4.5 cents.
The Albertans will get it removed completely if gas prices remain high, and I'd love to see the federal government do the same.
So there is no rebate at the moment. Thank you.
As I said, the federal government could always follow our approach and remove it completely.
Premier, earlier this year, you imposed a moratorium on all renewable energy projects in your province. Your decision impacted over $33 billion in energy investment and over 24,000 jobs. 6 months later, you then released a plan that would permanently ban or limit the construction of renewable energy in over 75% of Alberta, citing a concern that renewable energy projects have an impact on, and I quote, viewscapes. My question is, do oil rigs impact viewscapes? Yes or no?
The wind turbines are the size of the Calgary Tower or the CN
Asking about
Tower,
oil rigs.
whichever your
I'm asking
reference
about oil rigs, Premier. Yes or no? Do they impact
the-
viewscapes?
is. No, they're not the same size as the Calgary Tower.
Do coal mines impact viewscapes? Yes or no?
We only have 4 advanced coal projects in Alberta. The coal mining is actually more of a British Columbia issue.
Does the Gracie Lake coal mine, a project on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, impact viewscapes? Yes or no? I've got very limited time, Premier.
That was a project from the 1950s, and it's currently not in operation.
But does it impact viewscapes?
It's currently going through a regulatory process.
So do you think that oil and coal mines have a lesser impact on viewscapes than solar panels would?
I would say, as I said, it's the wind turbines we're concerned about because of the size of the Calgary Tower. And there, in some of these projects, there's 100 or 200 of them on a single site. And they also find themselves in migratory pathways, so they have an impact on bird and bat populations.
So
all of those things are concerned to us.
your restrictions will not impact solar panel projects, renewable projects in the province of Alberta?
They will. The issue around solar is making sure that it doesn't take up arable land, prime agricultural land. We're spending a lot of money with the federal government on irrigation, and there's certain uses that are incompatible. You can't put pivots on a landscape that has acres and acres of solar panels. So we're asking for them to be moved to marginal landscapes.
So I'm having a hard time if you're not going to allow renewable sources of energy to take place and create thousands of jobs and investment in Alberta. How are you proposing to reduce emissions that you're claiming that Alberta is doing when the evidence is to the contrary?
Well, the reason why we have so much solar and wind in our province is because we have a free market. You'll notice that there are many other jurisdictions that don't, so they don't have wind and solar. But the reason wind and solar makes sense in our province is because there's natural gas backup. You can talk to any solar or wind provider, and they know that we need natural gas. Natural gas has a carbon tax on it. And so if you want to see more wind and solar, you should take the taxes off of the peaker plants that are going to back them up.
Thank you, Premier. Chair, I'm just going to use my remaining time to move that the committee invite the International Association of Firefighters, IAFF, to appear in relation to the ongoing study on the main estimates. Thank you.
Sure. Well, how about if we release our witness and we can go to that?
Thank you.
Premier
Thanks,
Smith,
Mr.
thank
Chair.
you very much. Appreciate your
Appreciate
time.
it. Thank you to the committee.
Did you want to propose by a certain date or anything, Mr. Nackby, or?
As soon as yeah, we should have them. You're so good in scheduling witnesses so urgently that I have full faith and trust in you.
So on Good Friday, we'll be meeting with the IAFF. Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Speaking list, or are we fine to adopt that, colleagues? You want to just read it in slowly, just to make sure? Oh, I have Ms. Atwin, but do you want to just repeat it slowly, just so our clerk can write it?
I will,
right
and I would suggest that as soon as possible, Chair. And the motion reads that the committee invite the International Association of Firefighters, IAFF, to appear in relation to the ongoing study on the main estimates.
Sure. Before the estimates are tabled. How's that?
Yeah.
Ms. Atwin and then Ms. Backrack, or Mr. Backrack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking for some clarity. I wasn't sure if you were joking or not about meeting on Good Friday. I mean, this week has been full of surprises and curveballs, so I wouldn't completely rule that out, but I'd really like to know because I'd like to celebrate Easter with my family. Thank you.
Yeah, good one. Mr. Backrack, go ahead, then Mr. Kusmirchuk, then Mr. Lawrence.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I support the motion and.
Salut, Julien.
Nope.
Ça va bien, je suis en comité.
Oh, there we go. She's on
Please
with
start
somebody
again,
else, I
Mr.
think.
Backrack, please.
Yes, I certainly support the intention behind the motion and certainly support many of the goals of the International Association of Firefighters. I'm just curious because our study of the estimates is now taking some twists and turns into areas that are not traditionally directly associated with the estimates. Perhaps the mover of the motion could just provide a little bit of background on the subject area so that we can prepare adequately for the meeting.
We have Mr. Kuzmierczuk and Mr. Lawrence up, and then we can get back to Mr. Nakbi if he wishes to respond to that. But go ahead, Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And what I would just say as soon as possible, but during a regular sitting of the committee when the House is in session and when the House is sitting.
Fair. Mr. Lawrence, and then we'll go back to Mr. Nakbi if he wishes to respond. Mr. Backrack, and then Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd just like to amend the motion by including the following: Premier Fury, Premier Houston, and Premier King.
Sub-amendment. Okay, I will take a speaking order on the sub-amendment. Ms. Vignola, your hand is still up. Is that on the sub-amendment or the original amendment? And then Ms. Atwin, I assume on the sub-amendment?
Ça peut être autant sur
Well, it could be on both, in fact. The sub-amendment or the amendment. Well, as far as the Premier's appearance is concerned, here's my question. When we've gotten through the 10 Premiers of Quebec and Canadian provinces, as well as those in charge of the territories, well, it's important to hear from them, and I'll say this and I'll repeat it once again. I'm absolutely convinced that hearing from them will help us to reach consensuses, find solutions. That said, is this committee the right place? Well, yes, I know it's a matter of budgets, but shouldn't the premiers who have their own fora to discuss these issues, well, how should I put this? I'm just opening the door here to this possibility. If the committee does agree to hear from each and every premier from nationwide, and that is a majority decision, well, that's how it'll be. But I'm just wondering if we are the appropriate forum for this, the right place. Now, as far as the Firefighters Association are concerned, I'd be very curious to hear what the rationale is behind this. We seem to be, in a sense, kind of the omnibus committee, folks that should be appearing before the Environment Committee, the Finance Committee, that would better meet their objectives, and yet here they are landing here with us. So I'm kind of desperately trying to understand that, but I'd like to hear the rationale and justifications behind all of this.
Okay. Sorry, Ms. Atwin, we'll get you. I have a point of order.
Hoping I have the indulgence of the committee. I mentioned Premier Fury, Houston, and King, but I omitted to say Premier Ford, which I meant to include in the sub-amendment.
Ms. Atwin, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would echo a lot of the comments of our colleague, Ms. Vignola, as far as rationale. I'd also highlight that Premier Houston asked to appear at Finance, not at OGO, and the other premiers have not asked to appear here as well. So I'm questioning why their names would be included in this. I do appreciate that we're actually seeing a motion for this and that we're being involved in the discussion and decision making for this potential appearance, which is a nice market change from what we've been experiencing. But yeah, I'm going to need to know a bit more of the rationale around that as well. Thank you.
Kuzmierczuk, are you fine yielding the floor to Mr. Nakbi to explain? Oh, and then Ms. Vignola, will we be able to go to Mr. Nakbi to flesh out his motion a bit before, or would you like to speak first? Okay. Speak on the motion, and then of course we'll get back. I see Mr. Halland, then we'll return to the sub-amendment. I realize it's a tiny bit out of order, but we've had many requests for you to flesh out this motion.
So you want me to speak on the main motion?
Well, it was request I think three of our members were asking you to flesh out why the estimates, et cetera. So why don't we do that, and then we'll return to the sub-amendment.
Yeah, so look, we've now just spent 2 days talking about price and pollution, climate change, carbon tax. Speaker, with all due respect, Chair, with all due respect to you, you unilaterally invited a few premiers to come and present here. I think it's important to hear from people who are directly involved in dealing with the impact of climate change. Our firefighters are on the front lines, and all of us members have heard from them the impact of climate change, the kind of circumstances that they are seeing right now on the ground in pretty much every province across this country in terms of climate change, in terms of the impact of floods. They are the one who are being called upon to come and help Canadians every single day. If we have given an opportunity to 3 premiers and come and deny climate change, deny any action that should be taken to fight climate change, I think it's important that we hear from people like firefighters also to draw the complete picture as to the impact of climate change on Canadians and what are they seeing that impact is and the impact on them.